Hi, this is Paul. I've done quite a few conversation videos lately, and there'll be more. I've seemed to have a never-ending source of people who'd like to have a conversation, and I'm very happy about that. It's hard to get them all in, and so for those of you who have email sitting in my inbox that I haven't responded to, and those of you waiting to catch open rando slots via the Calendly app, I'm sorry. It's just time and energy. But I wanted to not just continue to post conversations, although they were good. It was quite interesting, the response to the Brett Sockold conversation. I'm a little surprised by it, and not disappointed. I like pushback, and I like people. I like people having a difference of opinion from me and letting me know in the comment section. That's absolutely okay. I can't sit here and preach the power and importance of conversation and productive dialogue and not have people disagreeing. And so, continue to disagree, make your point, state it well, argue your point passionately. I think that's how we all grow together. And I did a conversation with someone from a church in Portland today that I'll be posting soon. But again, I didn't want to just have too many conversations in a row. I want to do some of these other videos. It's a short week for me as a pastor because Monday was a holiday. So I don't know how much time I'll have to make videos. We'll see. But yesterday, I sat down and picked up Tom Holland's translation of Herodotus. If there's a bubble that we desperately need to break out of, it's the bubble of the now. And there's almost no better way to do that than to read history and, in fact, to take a look at primary sources. Now, through the magic of the kind of software library I have, I can read Tom Holland in English and check him against older translations of Herodotus and even the Greek now and then. And when Tom Holland, he writes the way he writes, and so his translation of Herodotus was just fun. Herodotus, of course, is the primary source about the Greek-Persian War. I sort of got prompted to do that because Saturday and Friday and Sunday I was catching up on some of the old some of the old editions of The Rest of History, which is Tom Holland's podcast with another contemporary historian. His name slips my mind right now. Listened to the podcast on Troy, and then they had Stephen Fry, who I didn't know was doing some work with classics and doing some translation and interpretation in the way Stephen Fry does. And so I caught both of those episodes of the podcast, and it just continued to reinforce for me the way modernity is unraveling and slipping away, along with it a sort of naive secularity. And I began Mythos, Stephen Fry's first book of his trilogy, and had some thoughts about that, but didn't have time to pull those thoughts together for a video today. But again, didn't want to let the video opportunity slip by. One of the impressions I had of reading Herodotus about the Ionian city-states over on the western edge of what today we call Turkey, the ancient kingdom of Lydia, Smyrna, Sarda. I mean, a bunch of these names that you'll find in the New Testament. Just getting a sense of the small places and the small kingdoms and the consequential agency. There's this great story where a king can't help but talk about how hot his wife is and tries to impress that upon his servant, his slave, who isn't in any disagreement, and so figures out a way to slip his slave in so that his slave can see his wife nude, and his wife figures all of this out, and then goes to the slave and says, well, I'll tell you what, you owe me because of, what my husband did. I'll give you an option. Either you work with me to kill my fool of a husband and you'll be king and I'll be your queen, or I'll have you killed. And so the slave decides to go with door number one, and then you have a transition of power. And you just have the sense in a lot of these stories that, these kingdoms, these city states were not necessarily very large, and although people might have been slaves or farmers or nobodies, the stories are full of little people who have really consequential places to play in history. And I thought of that, unlike sort of the situations we have now of these nation states with millions, and two of them at least over 1 billion people, and the small anonymous crowds of what so much life today is like, even though it's so much easier and more comfortable, at least for those of us who are more affluent on that scale. Also, I know I'm a little late to the party, 10 years late, 11 years late. My wife and I and one of my daughters have started on Downton Abbey. And my wife was looking for something to watch, and my daughter said, well, let's try this. And my daughter didn't think I'd be interested in it, but I was captivated by it, almost immediately. And it wasn't so much the period romance piece that really caught my attention. It was sort of after the sinking of the Titanic, you're looking at the turn of a page at the beginning of the 20th century in the United Kingdom. You see that a lord and his manor are increasingly a liability. And the Lord of I'm still only in season 1, so don't drop any spoilers in the comment section, please. But what does it take to manage to be a lord and to be a lady and to be a servant? And you just see that the page is turning on these people, and they're all trying to figure out how to play the best role they can play as the page turns. And there's something about that is very timely for us now, over a century later than when this was at least set. We feel pages turn around us, and those of us caught in the middle don't quite know how to pivot and how to respond to the changing of the times. So Downton Abbey, of course, is the system of nobility collapses into the modern age of individualism, choice, and agency. And servants of the house have to decide if they're going to continue to live in the house where there's at least some degree of security that maybe they'll take care of you when they're old, but increasingly, well, the Lord doesn't have that much money and he has to make practical choices. And so individuals having to navigate change is too big for them. And so it's something that I'm enjoying watching. Benjamin Boyce turned me on to this video. Joshua Mitchell gives a talk about Tocqueville. And the premise of it is, why does the state grow ever larger? Now, again, I have not been a political conservative. I've at least not identified that self. I guess I probably always have been to one degree or another, simply by virtue of my Christian faith. But one of the things that I haven't made it through the video completely yet, and it's always bad commenting on something before I actually get through it, but why stop now? The loss of middle space institutions, and I've heard this point in many different places, the loss of mediating institutions. And when you have the loss of mediating institutions, the state grows ever larger, basically demanded by individuals. The individual as a unit will naturally look to the state for protection, for appeal, for identity and validation, for the affirmation of convictions. And that's a lot of what we're seeing right now, and especially during COVID, with all of these lockdowns, you have intermediary institutions of all sorts being hampered and hobbled and weakened by these lockdowns. And again, I'm not saying that there isn't a degree of necessity to trying to curb the spread of the pandemic. I was talking to Warren, and a couple of months ago, he was complaining about the draconian measures instilled by the Australian governing authorities. But it seems like, to one degree or another, their measures have produced fruit, and they have they have a degree of freedom now and relief from the virus that we don't have currently in California. So, yeah, again, just something that sort of is in my hopper mentally, and I'll definitely finish this video and continue to think about it in terms of all the different things that I'm thinking about. I mentioned on Twitter the other day that I'm trying to do a video on the church's sex crisis, but I really haven't been able to come to really even get a PowerPoint to my satisfaction, and quite frankly, my standards are quite low. But the first slide basically looks at the Ravi Zacharias scandal, and my text on that first slide said, Christianity wants to bear witness to the fullness of life, but the inability to live its own sexual ethic up and down the hierarchy causes deep dissonance and I think provokes deconstruction. And I wrote that out probably 2 weeks ago or so, and again, I haven't really been able to pull the trigger on making the video, but that paragraph continues to work in my mind. That this is part of the turning of the page. You know, in Downton Abbey, you have a sense that yes, the church has to navigate the turning of the page at the beginning of the 20th century, and now the church is struggling to navigate the turning of the page at the beginning of the 21st century. The thing is, it isn't just about sex. You know, Justin Bieber has to find a glitzy new megachurch that can address his particular needs as a celebrity. My wife and I Saturday took about how far did we drive? Maybe 250 miles, just maybe even longer than that. Just drove for about 8 hours, and we like to do that sometimes just to get out of the city. And California has such amazingly beautiful wilderness areas that have good roads, and if there's no snow and ice on them in the winter months, it's just beautiful scenery. And sometimes we listen to audiobooks as we do that, and we got through most of Matthew McConaughey's little memoir. It was very interesting listening to her thoughts and comparing them to my thoughts. But you know, the kinds of things we're navigating as we turn the page aren't just about sexual standards, but because sexual standards are intertwined with all sorts of things: privacy, individuality, identity, consumerism, and I think in many ways the church's sex crisis has almost everything to do with ecclesiology. Another thing that haunts me is early in N.T. Wright's biography of the Apostle Paul. He makes this observation, which I think is critical in terms of thinking about the ancient world and thinking about the modern world. If there are parallels between today's complex societies and that of a city like ancient Tarsus, there's one radical difference, at least when seen from the modern Western perspective. In the ancient world, there was virtually no such thing as a private life. A tiny number of the aristocracy or the very rich were able to afford a measure of privacy. But for the great majority, life was lived publicly and visibly. You get that sense in Downton Abbey, too, where you have the nobility, and of course they have these servants that do everything for them, but of course the servants are watching them and trying to manipulate them and trying to manage the perception of the servants by those who have power over them in order to, secure for themselves a better life. So to be even a noble person in the 19th and beginning of the 20th century meant less visibility, less privacy, of course. The streets were mostly narrow, the houses and tenements were mostly cramped, there was noise and smell everywhere, and everyone knew everyone else's business. We can assume that many of the Jews in Tarsus would have lived close to one another, partly for safety. Jews absenting themselves from the official public religion, in quotes, Wright says. I want to see Tom Holland and N.T. Wright have more conversations. Including the celebrations of the imperial cult, were regularly seen as subversive, even though they tried, in other respects, to be good citizens. And partly for the ease of obtaining kosher food, the question of where one stood on the spectrum between strict adherence to the ancestral code, the Torah, and the compromise were not theoretical. They were about what one did and what one didn't do in full view of the neighbors. How different that is from us who live in these little boxes and look at these little screens and my eyes, my choice, my body, and how the neighbors might react. Last week I posted on Twitter, nationalism is the methadone of true religion, and I'll stand by that statement. Rebel Wisdom had, I thought, quite a good video on the QAnon shaman and the return of the mythic. I thought the guests that they had on really made some very salient point. The return of the mythic is, of course, the return of what we would call religion S, where, well, you have you all know as well as I do what's going on. People are finding themselves in the nationalistic political narrative. Why is that narrative become their base reality? Becoming agents on social media. And the social media increasingly is sort of the political stage where we are afforded participation in the political nationalistic imaginary. Protestant mental beliefism, participation, now finding expression towards the world, validated by agreements, likes, and opposition. When I go into social media and I raise the flag and fly the flag for my side, well, I'm doing the Lord's work, aren't I? Or I'm doing my side's work. You're fighting the good fight right there on your Facebook post and your Instagram and your TikTok and your YouTube channel, on and on and on. Nationalism is the methadone of true religion. And so we're separating the sheep from the goats on the other side of our computer screen, according to whether you are a Trumpist or a wokeist, at least online, at least in your own head as your social media persona. You're being a good, Christian, if Christian means one thing or another. I had a conversation today. Today was the day that I meet with my colleagues on Zoom, where we just try to support each other as pastors, almost all of us of small, struggling congregations. And I shared with them how, part of what's bothering me most about being a pastor right now is that the churches are also quite segregated. If you're not sharing pews with people who voted for Trump and people who voted for Biden, I'm not sure you're a church. If you're not figuring out how to love the people on the other political aisle, it doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It might mean you're very passionate about your beliefs, but finding a way to, you want to have influence with the other side. I increasingly find both sides just talking to their own echo chambers, and the amount of commonality between them is just getting thinner and thinner. And so even if you're a determined partisan from one side or the other, and even if you imagine that your evangelistic mission is to convince the other side, you have all the same struggles as a pastor in the most insular church would have, because you have absolutely no influence with someone who believes different than you, because you don't have any commonality with them, and you can't find common ground with which to actually maybe sway them to agree with your thinking a little more than the other. And the church is thinning out in this way, I think, is one of the real failures of the church at this time. Well, we're figuring out life, and life is always hard to figure out. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking about, okay, what does it mean to be church? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to live a good life? My thoughts turn to the second Lord's Day of the Heidelberg Catechism. Heidelberg Catechism has 3 parts: misery, deliverance, gratitude. The first part is entitled Misery. Doesn't sound to be the best, most salient part, but since most of the Catechism is just articulation of the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed and the 10 Commandments, and then some teaching about the sacraments, it's some of these other bits that really are the framing and the orientation. Lord's Day 2, question and answer 3. For question and answer 1 is, what is your only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, who has fully paid for all my sins and set me free from the tyranny of the devil. What's more, he watches over me in such a way that not a hair can fall from my head without the will of my Father in heaven. How can I live in, what is my only comfort in life and in death? Well, and the second part is, you need to know your misery. Well, how do I come to know my misery? Except, besides by just feeling it. And the Heidelberg Catechism takes a fairly law approach. The law of God tells me my misery. The law of God tells me I can't keep it. What does the law require of us? Christ teaches us in his summary in Matthew 22:37-40. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. It's a summary of the Bible. So here we have something at the top of the hierarchy. And, can you live up to all of this? Can you live up to all of this perfectly? Can you put your house in perfect order? No. I have a natural tendency to hate God and my neighbor. Knowing and doing good. Remarkably difficult. I liked how Brett Sockold opened up his article by referencing the good place. Almost anything we do now is just bound by an interlocking web of moral complexity. How on earth do we figure out what is the good, how to know the good, how to do the good? Loving God means basically addressing the totality. Loving your neighbor binds you to the specific. It's up and down. The personal, the now in the context of the totality. And, of course, we have a natural tendency to not do this, to not address the totality, but to think of me, and to not love my neighbor, but to make my neighbor my adversary. Well, that's cutting to the chase in terms of, what does it mean to lead a good life? Makes me think of Jordan Peterson's take on Piaget's equilibrated state. It's got to be good for me today and tomorrow, good for me today, tomorrow, and the next day, good for me and the person next to me, and that radiates out all the way into the world, all the way through time. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, there it is. The law and the prophets, that's for him, the Old Testament. There it is, the whole thing. Right there, these two commandments. You want it simple? There it is. You want a measure of what it means to lead a good life, to be a good person? It's right there. I was talking to Adam Crowell. I'll probably release this tomorrow morning, and then depending on what happens with my Randos conversation tomorrow, release Adam's conversation either tomorrow afternoon or, today's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday morning. I have a conversation with Mark from the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server coming up Thursday. Just because I want some more biographical information on him. But one of the things Adam Crowell mentioned in my conversation with him, which I thought was a terrific insight on Jesus, was he said, almost every time someone comes up to Jesus, and Jesus always has a specific thing for them to do. To the rich young ruler, sell all your possessions and come follow me. To the man shouting out, tell my brother to divide the inheritance. Be on your guard against all sorts of guilt or greed. Jesus always seemed to have exactly the right thing to say to someone, something specific, something for him. Didn't give him the whole world, just said, what does it mean to do the right thing? It means to do this. Or he puts them right at this moment that they're at. You're chewing on getting the stuff from your brother. Look at yourself. Think about your guilt. As a Christian minister, you'd think I should learn from Jesus, shouldn't I? Be better at it. The church is in crisis, and I think about that, and I really felt that as I was talking to my colleagues. churches really increasingly pressed towards anti-wokeism or this new definition of anti-racism, and they're just pressed and pressed and pressed. And I listened to Aaron Wren's take on Tim Keller today and tweeted a couple of those things today. But Aaron Wren has a very interesting, it sort of mirrors some of my thought on that, before the 20th century was what he calls a positive culture, and where the church and the culture were sort of in moral alignment. And then from basically 2000 to maybe 2014, you had a neutral space in which, and that's sort of afforded Tim Keller the ability to do what he did. But after 2014, now we sort of have the culture looking at Christianity and saying, you're part of the problem. And so Christians and churches face a much more hostile cultural environment. And his Aaron Wren's take on Tim Keller was that basically Tim Keller hasn't been able to adjust to that movement from neutral to negative space. And I think Wren really has a point. But the crisis of the church is nothing new. It's always in crisis. This is a picture of a little church in Bateuno in the Dominican Republic in the mid-1990s. And I came that day to do my little class, and so everybody showed up for church. And churches sitting on borrowed benches under sticks, under palm fronds that are sort of put off the top to keep the sun and the rain out. And I would imagine most days it didn't have anywhere near that number of people, because, of course, when the great white missionary would show up, everybody else would have to come and endure his poor Spanish, usually translated into marginally better Creole. Church is always in crisis, isn't it? This mediating institution that should disintermediate the ever-rising power of the state, but the state always wants the church to carry water for it. And pastors very quickly realize they can either draw a crowd or please a crowd by making certain kinds of noises that please certain kinds of political agendas. Church is always under pressure to use the church to carry the water of the state. Even though in many ways the state is sort of a modern copy of what at least certain instantiations of the church used to be. John Vervaeke was on Paul Anleitner's Deep Talks podcast recently, and as Sam mentioned in the Discord, John went into a little bit more autobiographical information. I thought it was a really good conversation. I've spoken with Paul a couple of times on my channel. I've been on his podcast a couple of times. But again, to me, it emphasized our need to learn to be a culture warrior like Jesus. And, what John was saying, even though, you all know, or many of you know, sort of where John has positioned himself with respect to Christianity, Jesus in some ways continues to stalk him, just as Jesus stalks Tom Holland and Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson. And as sort of this Christianity light humanism which is secularity continues to wane, this is going to be a really rough turning of the page for us. But, Jesus isn't going anywhere. And I think part of the job of a Christian is to figure out how to be a culture warrior like Jesus, to figure out exactly what it means to make the kinds of costly decisions and say the kinds of costly things that Jesus could say. One of the things I told my colleagues today in terms of my thought, at least on how to navigate these particular waters, is pay very close attention to Jesus and do as much digging as you can in terms of the historical background to see exactly why does he say that thing when he says it and how he says it. And it all contributes to why they killed him. I mean, again, you'd get this from my sermon last Sunday. Then my sermon changed a lot this past Sunday too. Jesus was dramatically unpopular. You'd think the Son of God could communicate clearly. Well, that's exactly why they killed him. They have churches on the right and the left trying to wield him. He with scarred palms will always cut the hand of those that try to wield him. He can't be wielded. Jesus can't be domesticated, tamed, put in a box. If there's anything that the gospel show, it's every box we try to put him in, he always escapes. We can never capture him. So those are some random thoughts. I hope that in the speaking of them, I wouldn't hate it so much I'd delete it. I do delete things now and then. But, yeah. How to live right now? I think follow Jesus. Study him closely. Become his disciple. And again, even John Vervaeke, who's, in many ways identifies more as a disciple of Socrates than a disciple of Jesus necessarily, but has tremendous respect for Jesus. That's really a good picture of John. I like that picture of John. Really captures something of his warmth and his friendliness. No, I don't. Why do I? Last year, at the beginning of the year, I did a video. Why am I still a Christian? I haven't found a better master. I haven't found anyone better to emulate. I haven't found anyone who I want to be more like than Jesus. That's a weird thing to say for a 21st century married man, isn't it? But when I think about who I want to be most like, yeah, it's Jesus. And when I think about who I want to take my cues from in this culture war, yeah, it's Jesus. Because on my tombstone, I don't want he was a Democrat or he was a Republican or he was a Trumpist or he was a wokester. I don't even want he was a moderate or he was a YouTuber or he was the pastor of the IDW. I'd want he was a disciple of Jesus Christ. And he tried to bring Jesus into the present in such a way that the wisdom and the power and the presence of Jesus were known to the people around him. If I can do that, then I will have done something. Thanks for watching my ramblings.